Story 1. The Maniac. Laughter on the Mountain. David Harper had always been a night person, the kind of guy who felt more alive when the world went quiet and the stars burned cold above the Appalachian Ridge. Chamberlain, Tennessee, wasn't much, a speck of a town, all sagging porches and dirt roads, nestled in a valley where the mountains loomed like sleeping giants. David liked it that way. At 28, he worked days at the feed store, hauling sacks of grain and cracking jokes with farmers, but nights were his escape. He'd lace up his boots, grab a flashlight, and walk up the ridge, past the old bridge, into the woods where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was his ritual, his way of shaking off the monotony, and he'd never felt anything but peace in those shadowed trails. That Friday started like any other. He'd clocked out at 6, grabbed a burger at Millie's Diner, and headed home to his one bedroom above the hardware store. The TV flickered with a grainy rerun of MASH. But he wasn't watching, just killing time until the clock struck midnight. His girlfriend, Sarah, hated his late walks. "It's not safe," she'd say, her voice tight over the phone, her fingers twisting the cord like she could pull him back through it. "No one's out there, babe," he'd laugh, brushing her off. "Just me and the owls," she'd sigh. Give up, and he'd promise to call when he got back. He always did, until he didn't. It was 1:03 a.m. when he hit the trail, the moon full and bright, casting the ridge in a silver glow that made the shadows of the pines stretch long and sharp. The air was crisp, October biting at his fingertips, and he shoved his hands deep into his jacket pockets, flashlight swinging loose at his hip. The path was familiar, up the slope, past the rusted bridge that marked the village's edge, then a steep climb to the summit, where the forest thickened. He'd walk to the clearing, a stump-filled circle where the local kids smoked weed and left empty beer cans, then loop back. 2 hours, tops. He'd done it 100 times. The bridge creaked under his boots, its iron frame groaning like an old man, and he crossed into the woods, the village lights fading behind him. The trail narrowed, roots snaking across the dirt, and the moon's glow dimmed under the canopy, turning the path into a tunnel of shadow. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark, catching glints of mica in the rocks. It was quiet, too quiet, he realized. The usual chatter of crickets and frogs gone, like the forest was holding its breath. A chill prickled his neck, sharp and sudden, and he stopped, sweeping the light around. Nothing, just trees, their branches swaying slow in the wind, whispering secrets he couldn't hear. He shook it off. Paranoia, he figured, from Sarah's nagging, and kept climbing. The summit wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes, and he could already see the clearing through the pines, a pale circle under the moon. But that chill wouldn't leave. growing into a heavy dread that sat in his gut like a stone. He'd felt fear before, hunting with his dad as a kid, hearing a bear's low growl. But this was different. This felt like the mountain itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. He reached the clearing, the stump in the center jagged and black, and stopped to catch his breath. The air was colder here, sharp enough to sting his lungs, and he turned off the flashlight, letting the moonlight wash over him. That's when he heard it, a laugh, low and manic, slicing through the silence like a blade. It came from his right, down the path that led to a smaller clearing the locals called the Hollow, a spot known for drifters and deals gone bad. The laugh wasn't right, too wild, too jagged, like whoever it was had lost their grip on sanity. David froze, hand on the flashlight, his pulse kicking hard. "Kids," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But the laugh came again, louder, closer, and it wasn't a kid's voice. It was a man's, deep and unhinged, the kind of sound you'd hear in a nightmare and pray you'd never meet in the flesh. David clicked the flashlight back on, beam shaking as he aimed it toward the hollow. The light caught movement, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and then a shape, just for a second. A head, pale and bald, peeking from behind a tree, eyes wide and gleaming under the moon. The laugh turned into a growl, soft at first, then rising, a sound that crawled up his spine and lodged in his skull. He stepped back, boots crunching on gravel, and swept the light behind him. No one there, just the path back down. The growl grew, the man stepping closer, his head tilting slow, like a predator locking on prey. David's mouth went dry, his breath fogging fast in the cold. He didn't think, just turned and walked, fast, keeping his eyes on the hollow, waiting for that shape to lunge. The laugh erupted again, violent and raw, and he heard stomps, 3, loud and heavy, like the man was charging. That's when David ran, flashlight bobbing, the mountain a blur around him as he tore down the trail, the echo of that laugh chasing him into the dark. David Harper's boots pounded the trail, each step a desperate thud against the Appalachian earth. The flashlight beam jittering like a moth trapped in a jar. The maniac's laugh chased him, a jagged sound that seemed to twist through the trees, growing louder with every stomp of those heavy feet. He didn't dare look back. His dad had taught him that much hunting deer. Glance, and you'd trip, maybe break a leg, maybe worse. The path sloped steep now, roots and rocks clawing at his ankles, and the cold air burned his lungs, sharp with pine and fear. The clearing was behind him, the hollow shadows swallowing that pale head, but the man was close, too close, and David could feel it, a heat on his neck, like breath. He stumbled, foot catching a root, and nearly went down, catching himself on a pine trunk, bark scraping his palm raw. The stomps quickened, a rhythm of rage, and that growl rolled out again, low and guttural, cutting through the wind. "Don't look," he hissed to himself, pushing off, running harder, the flashlight swinging wild. The trail curved, the bridge in sight below, rusted steel glinting under the moon, and he aimed for it, legs burning, heart a hammer in his chest. The laugh shifted, turning into a mutter, words he couldn't catch, but felt like curses, and the stomps followed, relentless, like the mountain itself was driving him down. He hit the bridge, iron groaning under his weight, and risked a glance. Mistake. The man was there, halfway up the trail, a gaunt figure in the moonlight, head shaved bald, eyes wide and black, mouth stretched in a grin that split his face. He wore a tattered coat, hands empty but curled like claws, and he moved fast, too fast for a man chasing downhill. David's scream stuck in his throat, and he ran, the bridge's edge blurring past, the village lights a faint promise below. The stomps stopped suddenly, the laugh fading into the wind, and David didn't stop until he hit his apartment stairs, slamming the door, locking it, collapsing against the wood, breath ragged. Sarah called at dawn, voice tight with worry. "You didn't call," she said, and he lied, said he'd fallen asleep early, forgot. He couldn't tell her about the man, not yet, not when his hand still shook and his mind replayed that grin. He showered, the hot water scalding away the dirt, but not the dread, and went to work, moving grain sacks like a zombie, avoiding the other guy's chatter. But the news broke that afternoon. A hiker found a body in the hollow, a woman in her 20s, stabbed 24 times, face, throat, abdomen, a mess of blood and mud. The sheriff's deputy, a grizzled man named Hale, came by the store, asking if anyone seen anything odd last night. David's gut twisted, but he shook his head, mumbled about being home, and Hale nodded, skeptical. The days after were a haze. David stopped his walks, stayed in, watched TV with the volume up, but that laugh haunted him, echoing in the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge. Sarah noticed, pressed him, and he cracked, spilling it all. The dread, the chase, the man's eyes. She paled, grabbed her laptop, and dug into local forums. Old threads popped up, whispers of a mountain madman, a drifter who'd lured hunters into the hollow, only for them to vanish or turn up dead, shot by mistake, or worse. One post claimed he laughed like a hyena, growled like a beast, and always vanished before dawn. David's blood ran cold. Those eyes, that grin, it fit. He went back a week later, couldn't help it, the mountain calling like a siren. Armed with a hunting knife and a stronger flashlight, he climbed climbed at dusk, heart pounding, aiming for the hollow. The air was thick, the silence heavier, and when he reached the clearing, the stump was gone, replaced by a shallow pit, dirt freshly turned, bloodstains dark in the moonlight. His stomach lurched, and he turned to leave when the laugh hit. Closer, right behind him, he spun, knife out, and there he was, the man, bald and gaunt, coat flapping, grinning wide, eyes black as coal. "You came back," he rasped, voice a growl, and lunged. David swung, the knife slicing air, and the man dodged, laughing, a sound that split the night. He tackled David, pinning him, breath hot and sour, and whispered, "She's mine, now." David kicked, broke free, and ran, the man's stomps fading as he hit the bridge again. He didn't stop until he was home, locking doors, windows, knife still in hand. The news next day confirmed it. The woman's body had been moved, signs of a struggle near the pit. No suspect, no prints, just whispers of a madman. David quit the walks for good after that. Sarah moved in, her presence a shield. But he'd wake, sweating, hearing that laugh, seeing those eyes. He started carrying the knife everywhere, checking shadows, jumping at every sound. Chamberlain stayed quiet, the mountain looming, and David knew the man was still out there, waiting, grinning, growling, ready for the next soul to wander too far. In a town where the past never died, he'd learned the hard way. Some laughs weren't meant to be heard. Story 2. The Crying and the Shadow. Starlight Ridge wasn't the kind of city that swallowed you whole, like Boston or New York, but it had its corners, quiet ones, where the streets grew narrow and the buildings leaned a little too close, whispering secrets in the fog. Emily Grayson lived in one of those corners, a third-floor walk-up on the edge of the old port, where the cobblestones gave way to cracked pavement and the air smelled of salt and diesel. At 26, she was a barista at the Bean and Brew, a cozy spot where tourists sipped lattes and locals grumbled about the weather. She liked her life, simple, solitary, with a stack of books on her nightstand and a tabby cat named Juniper, who purred loud enough to drown out the street noise. But lately, the quiet in her apartment felt wrong, like it was waiting for something to break it. The building was old, a narrow brick thing from the 1920s, with creaky stairs and walls so thin she could hear her neighbor, Mr. Callahan, snoring through the drywall. Her unit was small, one bedroom, a kitchenette with a stove that only half worked, and a living room just big enough for a thrift store couch and a TV she rarely turned on. The windows rattled in the wind, letting in drafts that made the curtains flutter like ghosts, and the radiator hissed like a snake with a grudge. Emily didn't mind. It was hers, paid for with tips and late shifts. A space to breathe after a childhood in foster homes that never felt like home. It started on a Tuesday, late September, the kind of night where the fog rolled in thick off the harbor and turned the streetlights into halos. Emily got home at 9, feet aching from a double shift, her apron still smelling of espresso and burnt milk. Juniper greeted her with a meow, weaving between her legs as she kicked off her sneakers and dropped her keys on the counter. She microwaved a frozen burrito, ate it standing at the sink, and scrolled her phone. Memes, texts from her coworker Jen about a rude customer. Nothing new. The TV stayed off. She wanted quiet, just her and the cat. The radiator's hiss, a soft backdrop. She was in bed by 11. Juniper curled at her feet, the room dark except for the faint glow of her phone as she read a Reddit thread about haunted houses. She laughed. Ghosts were for kids, not grown women with rent to pay. But the thought lingered as she set the phone down and closed her eyes. Sleep came slow, her mind replaying the day, until a sound yanked her awake, a sob, soft and broken, like a child lost in the dark. It came from the living room, muffled but clear, cutting through the radiator's hum. Emily sat up, heart thumping, and listened. Another sob, then a hiccup, the kind a kid makes after crying too long. "Juniper?" she whispered, but the cat was still at her feet, ears perked, staring at the door. Emily grabbed her phone, 2:17 a.m., and flicked on the flashlight, the beam shaky in her hand. She slipped out of bed, barefoot on the cold hardwood, and cracked the bedroom door. The living room was dark, the curtains still, but the sobs came again, louder now, from the corner by the couch. "Hello?" she called, voice trembling. No answer, just another sob, raw and desperate, tugging at her chest like a plea. She stepped out, light sweeping the room, couch, coffee table, TV, all in place, no one there. The sobs stopped, sudden as a snapped string, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against her ears. Juniper hissed, low and sharp, and bolted under the bed, tail puffed. Emily's skin prickled, every hair standing on end, and she moved to the corner, flashlight beam darting. Nothing, just the wall, a crack in the paint she'd meant to fix, and a faint smell, like damp earth after rain. She turned on the overhead light, the bulb buzzing to life, and the room looked normal again, empty and still. "Imagination," she muttered, but her hands shook as she checked the locks. Door, windows, all secure. No sign of a break-in, no footprints, nothing out of place. She grabbed a glass of water, downed it fast, and went back to bed, leaving the bedroom door open and the living room light on. Juniper stayed hidden, and Emily didn't sleep, just lay there, listening to the radiator hiss, waiting for the sobs to return. They didn't, not that night, but the air felt different now, heavier, like the apartment was holding its breath. The next morning, she laughed it off over coffee with Jen at the shop. "Probably a dream," she said, stirring sugar into her mug. Jen smirked. "Or your place is haunted. Old buildings, you know." Emily rolled her eyes, but the words stuck, gnawing at her as she worked her shift, smiling at customers while her mind drifted to that corner, that sound. She got home late again, checked the locks twice, and left the TV on low. A cooking show, bright voices to fill the quiet. But as she drifted off, Juniper at her side, she swore she heard it, a faint sob, just once, from the living room, calling her back into the dark. Emily Grayson didn't sleep much after that first night. The sobs came sporadic but relentless, always between midnight and dawn, always from the living room corner by the couch. She'd wake, heart pounding, Juniper hissing at her feet, and listen as the cries ebbed into silence, leaving the apartment heavy with a presence she couldn't name. Portland's foggy streets outside her window felt distant, the world shrinking to the four walls of her walk-up, where the air grew colder each night. The radiator's hiss, no match for the chill that seeped through the cracks. She stopped leaving the TV on. Its cheerful chatter felt like a lie, and started sleeping with the bedroom light on. Door cracked, a kitchen knife on the nightstand just in case. The third night, she tried to record it. She set her phone on the coffee table, camera aimed at the corner, and went to bed. Juniper curled tight against her. At 2:43 a.m., the sobs woke her, louder this time, raw and pleading, like a child calling for a mother who'd never come. She grabbed the knife, crept to the doorway, and watched the living room phone screen glowing faintly in the dark. The cries stopped, but the air shifted, a ripple of cold that made her breath fog. Then she saw it, a shadow, tall and blurry, slipping across the wall by the couch, moving like smoke, but solid enough to block the streetlight's glow. It paused, head-shaped blob, tilting as if listening, then vanished around the corner toward the kitchen. Emily's legs shook, the knife slick in her sweaty palm, but she didn't move, not until the radiator clanged, startling her into a gasp. She checked the phone. Nothing, just static and darkness. The video cutting out at 2:45 a.m. Juniper wouldn't leave the bedroom, tail puffed, eyes wide, and Emily spent the rest of the night on the couch, light on, knife in hand, staring at the corner. Dawn broke gray and wet, rain tapping the windows, and she called in sick to the Bean and Brew, unable to face the world with her nerves so raw. She needed answers. Over a pot of coffee, she scoured the internet, Reddit threads, local history blogs, anything about her building. A post on a Portland Hauntings forum caught her eye. 99 Danforth Saint, 1920s tenement. Woman died in 1931. Suicide. Left a kid behind. Emily's stomach dropped. Her address. The woman, Clara Hensley, had hanged herself in the third-floor apartment after her husband left. Her 5-year-old daughter, Ellie, sent to an orphanage. The post mentioned crying heard by tenants over the years. A shadow, some swore, followed them. Emily's hands shook as she read, the sobs replaying in her mind. That shadow's tilt, too real to dismiss. She went to the library that afternoon, digging through microfilm with a librarian's help. A kind older woman named Mrs. Tate, who smelled of lavender and mothballs. They found a grainy photo. Clara, thin and hollow-eyed, holding a small girl with pigtails. Ellie, staring blankly at the camera. A 1931 article confirmed the suicide, noting Ellie's screams as neighbors broke in too late. Emily stared at the photo, a lump in her throat. The sobs weren't just a haunting, they were a plea. A little girl trapped in grief, her mother's shadow lingering like a curse. That night, Emily didn't wait for the cries. She lit a candle, lavender, a gift from Jen, and sat on the couch, facing the corner, a notebook in her lap. "Ellie," she whispered, voice trembling. "I hear you. I'm here." The radiator hissed, Juniper watching from the bedroom doorway, and the air thickened, cold enough to make her breath fog. At 2:50 a.m., the sobs started, soft at first, then rising, a wail that clawed at her heart. Emily stood, candle flickering, and spoke louder. "Ellie, I know what happened. I'm so sorry." The sobs stopped, replaced by a shuffle, slow, dragging, like bare feet on wood. The shadow appeared, taller this time, its edges sharper, moving from the corner toward her. Emily froze, candlelight glinting off the knife she'd grabbed. But the shadow didn't lunge. It paused, head tilting, and a voice whispered, faint as a breeze, "Mama?" Emily's eyes stung, tears spilling. "I'm not your mama, sweetheart," she said, voice breaking. "But I'll help you." The shadow quivered, then retreated, fading into the wall, leaving a scent of damp earth and sorrow. Emily didn't sleep, just sat there, candle burning low, Juniper creeping out to curl in her lap. She wrote in the notebook everything she'd learned, everything she'd felt, promising Ellie she'd find a way to set her free. The next day, she bought sage from a shop on Congress Street, burned it in every room, the smoke curling thick as she whispered, "You can rest now." The sobs stopped after that, the shadow gone, but the air never felt the same. Lighter, yes, but heavy with memory. Emily kept the photo of Clara and Ellie, taped it to her fridge, a reminder of the little girl who'd cried for her mother. In Portland, where the fog held ghosts, she'd given one a voice, and maybe, just maybe, a little peace. Story 3. The Plea in the Woods. Creekview Hills, Kansas, was a blink-and-you-miss-it town, tucked into a fold of pine-choked hills, where the wind carried the scent of sap and the occasional whiff of something older, something wild. Mike Callahan had hunted these woods since he was a boy, a wiry man of 32, with calloused hands and a beard that hid a scar from a buck's antler years back. He worked at the lumber mill by day, stacking logs until his shoulders ached, but weekends were his escape, his rifle, his tent, and the quiet of the forest where the world couldn't reach him. The spot he loved best was deep in the Tarker's woods, a clearing by a stream where the deer trails crossed and the stars burned bright through the canopy. That Saturday, he'd packed light, rifle, sleeping bag, a thermos of coffee, and driven his beat-up Chevy Blazer to the trailhead just as dusk settled, the sky bruising purple over the hills. The air was crisp, late October biting at his knuckles, and he hauled his gear a half-mile in, boots crunching leaves, the stream's murmur guiding him. He set camp by a flat rock, built a fire, and settled in, the flames licking the dark, casting shadows that danced like old friends. Mike liked the solitude. His wife, Linda, stayed home with their toddler, and he relished the break from her nagging about safety. "Wolves don't care if you're armed," she'd say. But he'd laugh, pat his rifle, and promise to be back by Sunday. The night was still at first, the fire crackling soft, the stream a steady lullaby. He sipped coffee, cleaned his rifle, and listened to the woods settle, owls hooting, branches creaking. Around 3 a.m., the fire had died to embers, and Mike was nodding off, rifle across his lap, when a voice cut through the quiet. "Help me, please." It was a woman's voice, high and desperate, coming from the trees beyond the clearing, where the shadows thickened into a wall. He jolted upright, hand on the rifle, heart kicking. The voice came again, trembling. "Please, I need help." Closer now, but muffled, like she was hidden in the brush. Mike squinted into the dark, the fire's glow barely reaching the tree line. He didn't move, not yet. He'd been hunting long enough to know better than to rush toward a stranger's cry in the night. Years ago, a buddy had followed a call like that, only to get jumped by a couple of junkies who stole his gear and left him bleeding. Mike stayed put, finger on the safety, and called back, "Who's there? Step into the light." The voice didn't answer, just repeated, "Help me, please." A plea laced with panic, but no figure emerged. He grabbed his flashlight, swept the beam through the trees. Nothing but pine trunks and shadows, the beam shaking in his grip. The air grew heavier, the forest holding its breath, and Mike felt a prickle on his neck, the kind that warned of eyes in the dark. He stood, rifle ready, and took a step toward the sound, the leaves crunching underfoot. "I can't see you," he shouted, voice rough. "Come out, or I'm not coming closer." The plea shifted, a hint of irritation creeping in. "Please, I'm hurt. Hurry." But still no movement, no face. He stopped, 5 yards from the fire, the flashlight catching a flicker, something pale, low to the ground, darting behind a tree. His gut tightened. That wasn't a woman stumbling wounded. He backed up, the fire's warmth a weak shield, and set traps. Small snares he'd brought for rabbits, strung low around the clearing. "If you're real, you'll trip one," he muttered, more to himself than the voice. The forest stayed silent after that, the plea fading into the wind, and Mike sat by the embers, rifle across his knees, watching the traps. Sleep wouldn't come. He kept seeing that flicker, hearing that voice, wondering if it was a trick or something worse. The woods of Tarker's Mills had stories, old ones about lost hunters and voices that led men astray, and Mike had always laughed them off. Now, with the fire dying and the night pressing roll in, he wasn't so sure. Morning broke gray and damp, mist curling through the trees, and Mike checked his traps. Untouched, no sign of anyone. He packed up fast, nerves jangling, and hiked back to the blazer, the rifle heavy on his shoulder. At the diner, over eggs and bacon, he told Linda about the voice, leaving out the flicker. She frowned. "You should have called the ranger." He nodded, but his mind was on the woods, that plea echoing. Back at the mill, the guys swapped hunting tales, and Pete, a grizzled vet with a limp, leaned in. "Heard that before," he said, voice low. "Folks follow it, don't come back. Or they do, with holes in them." Mike forced a laugh, but the coffee turned bitter in his mouth. That night, home with Linda and the kid, he couldn't shake it. The news flickered on. Another hiker missing near Tarker's Woods, last seen Friday. Mike's hands went cold. He didn't go back that weekend or the next, but the woods called, a pull he couldn't explain. He started dreaming of that voice, that flicker, and waking with a start, the rifle by his bed. Tarker's Mills stayed quiet, the hills looming, and Mike knew whatever was out there, it wasn't done with him yet. Mike Callahan couldn't stay away from Tarker's Woods, not after that night. The voice, high, desperate, pleading for help, echoed in his dreams, waking him in cold sweats, his rifle a heavy comfort by the bed. Linda noticed the change, her eyes narrowing over breakfast as he stared into his coffee, silent. "You're not going back," she said, voice sharp, but Mike didn't answer, just kissed her forehead, ruffled their toddler's hair, and left for the mill. The forest pulled at him, a siren's call he couldn't ignore. And by Friday, he was packing again. Rifle, traps, a heavier knife this time. The weight of it, a grim promise. He reached the clearing at dusk, the same spot by the stream, the flat rock still charred from his last fire. The air was colder now, November creeping in, the pines whispering low as the sun bled out over the hills. He set camp fast, tent staked, fire roaring, traps strung wider this time, a perimeter of snares and tripwires to catch anything that moved. He sat by the flames, rifle across his lap, flashlight on the rock, and waited, the stream's murmur a faint backdrop to the night's heavy silence. Pete's warning gnawed at him. Hunters vanishing, bodies found with holes, always after a woman's cry. Mike wasn't a fool. He'd come prepared, but his hands still shook as he sipped coffee, eyes scanning the dark. At 3:14 a.m., it came again. "Help me, please." The voice sliced through the quiet, same as before. High, panicked, a woman in distress. It echoed from the same spot, beyond the tree line, where the shadows thickened into a black wall. Mike gripped his rifle, finger on the safety, and stood, the fire's glow at his back. "Show yourself," he shouted, voice rough, flashlight beam cutting through the trees. The plea repeated, "Please, I'm hurt." But no figure emerged, just the rustle of leaves, faint and wrong, like something moving low to the ground. He swept the light, catching a flicker, pale, quick, darting behind a pine. His gut twisted. It wasn't a woman, not the way it moved. He held his ground, traps between him and the voice, and called again, "I'm armed. Step out or I shoot." The plea turned sharp. "Don't shoot me, please." And the rustling grew, branches snapping, closer now. Mike's heart pounded, the beam shaking in his hand, and he aimed the rifle, ready to fire at anything that crossed the firelight. But the voice shifted, a growl creeping into its tone. "Come here, now." And the panic turned to anger, a demand that made his blood run cold. He backed toward the tent, keeping the fire between him and the trees, and waited, every nerve on edge. A trap snapped, wire taut, a snare triggered, and the voice screamed, shrill and unhuman, a sound that tore through the night. Mike swung the light, catching a shape, low, pale, not a woman, but a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, tangled in the snare. He wore a tattered coat, hands clawing at the wire, and his grin, wide, jagged, split his face as he laughed, a manic sound that echoed Pete's stories. Mike froze, rifle raised, but the man yanked free, blood dripping from his leg, and lunged back into the dark, laughter trailing like a curse. Mike fired, once, twice, shots cracking through the woods, but the man was gone, swallowed by the shadows. He didn't sleep, just sat by the fire, rifle ready, until dawn broke, gray and cold. The trap was bloodied, a scrap of coat caught in the wire, but no body, no tracks. Mike packed up, shaking, and hiked out. The forest too quiet. The stream's murmur a mocking lullaby. At the diner, he told Pete, voice low, about the man, the scream, the laugh. Pete's face hardened. "That's him," he said, pulling out a crumpled photo from his wallet. A missing hunter, Larry, last seen 5 years back. Same spot. Heard a woman's voice, followed it. Found his pack, but not him. Folks say he's still out there, luring. Mike's stomach dropped. The man in the snare matched Larry's photo. Same gaunt face, same wild eyes. The news that week confirmed another death. A hiker, gutted, found a mile from Mike's clearing. Throat slashed like Larry's old hunting knife had done the work. Mike didn't go back. Couldn't. Not with Linda's eyes on him. Her hand tight in his at night. He burned the scrap of coat in the backyard. The smell of blood and rot lingering in the air. And started sleeping with the rifle by the door. But the dreams didn't stop. That voice, that laugh, the man's grin as he'd torn free, whispering, "Come back." Mike knew he wouldn't, not willingly, but Tarker's Mills had a way of holding on to its ghosts, and the woods weren't done with him. He started hearing it some nights, faint through the window, a woman's plea, drifting on the wind, calling him back to the clearing. He'd grip the rifle, check the locks, and tell Linda it was nothing, just the neighbors. But Juniper, their new stray cat, would hiss at the dark, and Mike would see that grin in his mind, those eyes, waiting in the pines. In a town where the forest never forgot, he'd learned to listen and to stay the hell away.